Hello and welcome back. This is part 2 in a series, so be sure you've completed part 1 before watching this, otherwise you won't quite know what we're up to. I'll leave a link to part 1 down in the description below. Alright, so what do we have so far as a brief recap? We have an app wherein we can add a new entry, and when we submit it, it shows up inside of this list. As it stands right now, the first piece of functionality that I would like to implement is that I would like to be able to remember this list, because watch what happens if I refresh the page. It's gone. Well, why is this? First, over here, our JavaScript gets executed like this every time. So right here, this is where we're storing the to-dos, or the data for the to-dos. And inside of here, this is being initialized out to an empty array every time. So whenever we start up the page, it reinitializes out to an empty array. So our first goal is to make it so that we have somewhere where we can store this information, and then we can retrieve it when the page first loads, rather than assigning it to this empty array. In our context, we're going to be using local storage. Local storage is a storage area inside of modern browsers, wherein you can keep key value pairs. For our purposes, we're going to be tucking our entire array into one key value pair inside of here. It's going to have the name of to-dos, or the key of to-dos, and the value of the entire array turned into something that this can store. Now, the reason I put that last part on there, something that this can store, is because the key must be a string and the value must be a string. So we're going to do a little bit in terms of making it so that the data that we look at inside of this array can be represented by a string. Luckily, there's a library built into JavaScript that will do all the heavy lifting for us. Let's start with first, making it so that anytime we modify our to-do list, we update what's inside. We have something that can consistently update all the bits and pieces that need to be notified. I'm going to create another function named update local storage. This guy is going to be responsible for, whenever something changes inside of to-dos, updating what's inside of our local storage store for it. And because I now have two things that I would like to pretty reliably happen every time I modify what's inside of our to-dos array, I'm going to go ahead and make it so that there's one function that I can conveniently call that will invoke both of these if I want both of them to go off. Yeah, that sounds like a good idea. Let's go back to, no, onList update is fine. So this onList update is going to be responsible for invoking update local storage, which we'll get to in just a second, as well as the render list that we had previously. And I'm going to go ahead and change out my reference to render list here to be onList update, so that when I push a new entry as a result of that form being submitted, I not only go over and invoke render list, but I also invoke update local storage. All right, so that's the threading it through. Let's go ahead and make sure that update local storage is doing what we want it to. So we know that to-dos is stored inside of this global array inside of our context. We want to be able to grab that, turn it into a string representation of that same data, and then update our local storage at the key that we're going to use to be that value. All right, let's look through these steps. First, I'm going to go ahead and call this stringified to-dos. And I'm going to store in there the result of json.stringify to-dos. That's as easy as that is, but let me demonstrate the difference between to-dos and stringified to-dos. If I console.log to-dos, and I console.log stringified to-dos, let's go ahead and invoke that function, ASD add to do. Let's make sure console is focused. I get two console.logs. The first one, remember, is the actual to-dos array. So this is to-dos in a data format. It's an actual array that knows what's inside of here, has elements at the index of 0, in this case, da-da-da-da-da-da. Down here, this is the stringified version. This is no longer that pretty array. It is a string that looks like that pretty array. But that's okay because that's exactly what we need in order to store it inside of here, because this cannot store an array as the value. So we're going to store a stringified version of the array. So over here, now that I have a stringified version of it, I'm going to use the local storage setup in order to set an item by, let's go ahead and say that the key is going to be to-dos, to stringified to-dos. All right, let's see what that does. I'm going to refresh the page real quick. Over here, I'm going to add feed goldfish. I'm going to hit add to-do and watch over here. Now I've created a new key value pair inside of my local storage with the key of to-dos and the value of feed goldfish. Well, really an array with feed goldfish inside of here. And you might be thinking, all right, Tim, hold on. You said this was the stringified version. Why down here is it treating it like an array again? Well, that has to do with the fact that Chrome, as a browser, and most modern browsers, understand that, hey, I know you might be storing this as a string, but it's only because you have to. So I'm going to see if I can't interpret it as either an array or an object. And if I can, then I'm going to treat it like one when I give you the preview down here for it. Up here, this preview is always going to be the stringified version. This is Chrome's attempt at making it the not stringified, the actual array or object version of it. So now we have this. If I refresh the page, this will stick. The local storage inside of a modern browser is responsible for holding onto the information in between sessions or in between times that you come to the page. I just refreshed the page and this is still here. Well, that's all well and good, and I can keep adding to, or no, I won't do that yet because it won't pull the right values out. But this is here, but it's not here. And that has to do with what we were originally talking about, which is on line 3. We said const to-dos every time is this empty array. Well, the keen amongst you might recognize that if there's a local storage, or might surmise that if there's a local storage.set item, to-dos, whatever, there's probably a local storage.get item, to-dos. So we're going to go ahead and say that to-dos is equal to local storage.get item, to-dos. And there's a couple of caveats. I'm going to introduce the issue first and then provide a solution. Let's go ahead and save that, head over here. The first thing is, this is string. This is the string version of it. So if I pull this out and do this, local storage.get item to-dos, I'm going to get this as a string, which doesn't help me much because down here when I attempt to, let's do this real quick. After the initial loading of the to-dos, we don't get anything here. Let me just take a step back because we only load them into memory. The only thing that was responsible for calling render list previously was our event listener after it invoked to-dos.push. But over here, I want to make it so that if once the app has loaded up, if it loaded something from local storage's to-dos item, then I want to render the list. And notice that I'm using render list here instead of on list update, because calling update local storage at this point after I just pulled to-dos out of local storage is kind of redundant. So I'm being a little bit efficient with it. If I save this and head over to the browser, let's see if I can't get it to freak out. Yes, I did. Okay. To-dos.forEach is not a function. Well, why? This comes back to what I was trying to talk about to start. What's inside of there right now is exactly what's inside of local storage at the item of to-dos, which you and I know is a string representation of an array. So I need to use the other part of the JSON library. Instead of stringifying it, I want to turn it from a string variant into a data variant. So here I'm going to go ahead and say json.parse. That is going to take the string representation of that array and turn it into a data representation. Now if I give it a shot, there she is, feed goldfish. All right. And if I refresh the page, she keeps coming back. If I add feed cat, we can see that not only did we update the rendering of the list on the page, we also saved it back over in the data store with the feed goldfish that was there previously, because that's inside of our to-dos now at the very start, but also the new entry that we added onto it. So we are making it so that we have an in-memory store inside of this to-dos variable, but we also have a saved, an on-disk storage of this entry inside of local storage. All right. The next thing that I would like to be able to do, now that I can save that information and keep it coming back every time, is I would like to make it so that I can delete one of these. So if I want to have a delete button next to each entry, and when I click on it, I would like that entry to disappear, not only from the page, but also from inside of our local storage and our in-memory array. So, in order to start there, we need to make it so that when we render the list, we not only have the name of the entry that we're dealing with, but also the delete button that we want to pop up next to it. So down here, inside a render list, we clear off the inner HTML of the list, and for each entry inside of the to-dos array, we render that list item by creating an li and tucking the inner text inside there. I'm going to change this just a bit in order to separate out the concerns here. We're going to say that there's a item name element, and that is document.create element. We're going to make a span for this. If I can spell element, there we go. And we'll set the inner text to this guy. Well, this creates a span in memory, sets its inner text equal to whatever the item's or whatever the item's description is. But if I save this just like it is, we just get the each of the LIs without anything inside of them because, well, we didn't append this span into this LI element. So under here, I'm going to go ahead and say li element dot append child item name element, just like I did list element dot append child li element. All right, so why did I do this? I'm creating an li, and I'm tucking a span inside of it. The only difference between what we were doing before and now is before we did not have this span wrapped around the text. And the reason for that is I want to treat this li as kind of the wrapper for our list item now, because the wrapper will contain both the span with the text inside of it, as well as the button that will allow us to delete things. I don't want to cross the two. So I'm making sure that they're distinct elements. So the thing that contains the item's description is going to be inside of the span. That span is going to live inside of the li, but also the button is going to be its own button tag that lives inside of the li after the item name element. So if I save this, now we should figure out what I didn't type properly. Oh, you know, li element is not a function, so we have to put li element at append child. That's what I meant to put there. And we have a button. Now we have a button with a span and the button. We just need to put some text inside of there. The text for this is going to be a static bit of text, so let's go ahead and say delete button element dot inner text, just like we did before, equals, let's say delete. Let's just put an X next to it. And there we go. Now we have an X button. Let's, yeah, I'm okay with that. Not really. I'm going to put some space between the two of them. So I'm just going to put a space. I'm going to graft an empty space onto the end of the name. It's a little pedantic because it's just adding a space at the end of the span, but visually we can see the difference now between the name and the X button. I'm not going to over-engineer that. I'm just doing it for it looks pretty right now. All right, so now, if this button is clicked, we want to invoke some sort of function that knows that we're talking about getting rid of feed goldfish, for example, if I click this one. And it removes feed goldfish from our to-dos array and then calls onList update. So inside of here, we need to know a couple of things. We need some way to uniquely identify the to-do on the list. I'm going to say that the index of the element inside of the array is enough for this exercise. So for example, this feed goldfish inside of the to-dos array, where is she? Is at element 0. So I'm going to make it I'm going to refactor what we currently have for render list items such that it takes into account the index when it's rendering the item. So it would know that not only is the text of this element feed goldfish, but also the index of it is 0 and feed cat is 1. That way, when I click the delete button, I can go, oh, delete the one at 0, so feed goldfish, or delete the one at 1, feed cat. Let's go over how that's going to look real quick. Over here, when we render it, we have this button we just created. We want to attach an event listener to it in the same way that we added a submit event listener to this form element. Except this time we just want to listen for this button to be clicked. So over here, I'm going to go ahead and say delete button element dot append add event listener click. And I'm going to create a function that's going to be invoked. Did I declare it? Yeah, okay. This one, we won't care about the event so much because we don't need to prevent the default like we did inside of the form element submit, because we only really care about that contextually in our project so far if a form was submitted inside of JavaScript, because we don't want the page to refresh. Merely clicking this button isn't going to have that effect. So inside of here, just to make sure this is clicked up so far, I'm just going to console.log the item's name. We're not going to do anything other than that. So if I head over here and I have the console open and I click on one of these X's, feed goldfish, feed cat. Well, great. That works as a great button to be able to see what the text of the item is. But let's see if we can't get it to render console.log the index. In order to do that, we're going to backtrack and take a look at where render list item is invoked. And that's going to be here. I mean, it's not really invoked here. It's passed through to for each as the function that will be invoked by for each underneath the hood. So when I do todos.forEach and I pass this through, for each knows to go over each element inside of this array and pass it through to render list item one at a time. That's why here we know that we can get the item out. Well, for each also gives us 2 more parameters that it passes into the function that you give it. It gives you to start the item that we're referencing so far. So in our case, the string, each of the strings inside of our to-do, one at a time. The second element, or the second parameter that it gives you, is the index, luckily, of the element inside of the array. The third thing, and if you come up with a use for this, let me know. A practical use, not a contrived one. I've really tried to look for one over the years. Is the entire array that we're iterating over. So it'll get us the to-dos array. I don't see a use for that right now. We're just going to stick with item and index. And yes, in JavaScript, if we have a function that is being invoked with some parameters, we don't necessarily have to even worry about those. If we don't list them, we just don't take them. But they are given to us in order, and we have to respect that order. So if I just wanted index and I didn't want item, I would still have to put something here, and then comma, and then some name for index. Otherwise, if I didn't do that and I just had this, that would not give me index. That would give me the item, each of the items inside of to-dos, inside of this variable named index, which would be kind of misleading. So inside of here, I have each item coming through, which is the string. But now I also have the index. Let's just go ahead and hot swap this out. If I head back over here now, let's head over to console. I'm going to click on feed goldfish, 0. And if I click on feed cat, 1. Okay, so we are confident that each of these entries, let's be a little bit more confident. Give me a feed dog. If I click on feed dogs, it is at index 2 inside of the array. Okay, cool. It's doing what we expect it to. Now, we know that we can reliably pass the index for the element whose delete button was clicked into some function. Right now we're passing it to console.log, but let's make it so that we pass it into a function that's responsible for deleting that entry at that index. In order to do that, I'm going to come back to this for a moment to just have a little bit of commentary. Right now, this is an event listener that's responsible for a lot of stuff that's going on. I want to make it so that it does the logic that it needs to do in terms of the form being submitted, but also so that we extract the functionality that's responsible for just adding a new entry. So I'm going to make a new function named add entry. And you'll see why I do this in just a second in terms of the delete entry. I mean, I just said it out loud. It might sound a little bit, it might make a little bit of sense if I do that. But down here, I'm going to move my todos.push and my onList update into this add entry function. I'm going to say that it has content, that it will take the parameter of content, which means up here, I can invoke add entry instead and pass through that content variable here. So, don't get this mixed up real quick. Here, we are still grabbing the content inside of that target form.content.value, that text that's inside of that input. Here, we're passing that text into add entry, which is now a function that does those two steps that are responsible for adding a new entry to our to-do list. It pushes a new entry to the end of our list, or our array, and it invokes the onList update function. Obviously, we can call this whatever we want, because this is the variable that lives inside of our function, our parameter that lives inside of here. It makes sense to call it content just because that's what it is, but we don't necessarily have to call it content just because we called this one content. They're two separate entities. So let's make it so that we have also a function remove entry. And when we remove an entry, what do we need to know? The index of the entry, which is what we've been prepping down here. So rather than console.logging index, let's go ahead and remove entry index. Up here, we'll go ahead and console.log the index that we're taking in as a parameter in order to demonstrate that it's still getting that 1, 2, 0. Yeah, sure. But now we want to modify this such that instead of just console.logging that index, we go into our array, find the element at that index, take it out, and then onList update again, just like we were doing with the todos.push when we were doing the add. In order to do this, there's a handy-dandy function on every array called splice. I'm going to go ahead and invoke it here, and it's kind of a Swiss Army knife of removing and adding entries. In our case, we're only going to use the remove logic because we already have todos.push in order to add our entry. Here, I'm going to go ahead and say todos.splice index 1. This is the simplest usage that we're going to do for this. What we're doing is we're saying, hey, todos, I want you to go into your elements, and at the index of whatever index I've received, remove one element. And it's going to modify todos in place, just like push modifies todos in place. So if we invoke onList update after this, todos should be updated to not have that entry that we removed at that particular index. And we should be able to update what's inside of local storage now without that entry that we just removed, as well as render the list onto the page without that entry. Let's test it. Goodbye, cat. There she is. And if we take a look over here inside of memory, it was feed goldfish, feed cat, feed dog. Now it's just feed goldfish, feed dog. There we go. We can see that live now, and no more entries. All right. So we can remember things inside of local storage between refreshes. We can remove entries. We've refactored it a bit so that we have this add entry and this remove entry. And now we have this chunk that's responsible for doing the update logic. In fact, I might make it so that we have a little bit of commentary here to let us know what section we're inside of. Let's say CRUD functionality, create, read, update, and delete. This is our update functionality. And this is our event listeners. These are our event listeners. So I got my three main sections here. All right, let's clean this up just a bit. One thing that I forgot on line 3, we're JSON.parsing local storage.get items to get item to-dos. Well, what happens if there's nothing inside of local storage at that item index or at that item key? Let's go ahead and I'm going to right click the to-dos key and delete. So she's gone. What happens if I refresh the page? Uh-oh, we don't like that. There's an error. Let's head over to console, cannot read properties of null. Reading for each. So it's attempting to read for each off of something that has come out to null when we don't expect it to be. If we head over to script.js line 46, that is the line that's responsible for looking over each entry inside of to-dos. So it's not for each that's the problem. It's the fact that for each doesn't exist on whatever is inside of to-dos. Well, to-dos was json.parse this. So we can surmise that this is now null, or this is resolving out to null, if there is no entry inside of local storage with that key. Okay, if this is null, I want it to default out to an empty array, so we have something to start with. So I'm going to go ahead and say that this is either this statement or null. In this case, what's happening is we're using JavaScript's laziness to our benefit. JavaScript goes A or B. All right, if A is true then, I'm just going to give you A, or if it's truthy. If A is falsy, then I'm going to go ahead and give you B. It doesn't worry about turning A or B into true or false, and then giving you back explicitly true or false. It just gives you one of A or B. So in this case, you can think about this as saying, either give me what is inside of local storage.getItem to-dos parsed out to be an object, to be a data representation of what's inside of there, or if this is falsy, which null is, go ahead and give me an empty array. Now if I head back over, that error is gone. And if I continue and feed a goldfish, or add feed goldfish to my to-do list, she shows up just fine. And there's our to-do list showing up inside of the application's local storage. All right, so we can now add an entry. Remember the entry in local storage, we can remove an entry. Let's make it so that we can adjust an entry, and this is probably going to be the largest thing that we're going to do here. Over here, we are going to make another function. I'm going to start working from what we want the outcome to be backwards to what we want the interaction to be this time. We want to toggle complete on an entry with a given index. For this, we are going to look through, we're going to look through the array for the entry at the given index and set its completed value to the opposite of what it currently is. Well, right now, each of the entries inside of our array is a simple string. That showed a lack of foresight on my side, because now, how do we say that that feed goldfish is incomplete? We can't tell the string that it's incomplete. So we're going to create an object, something that can store a little bit more information. And again, I created this error so that I can demonstrate the problem once we got to it. Because we can't store additional information for each of these entries, I mean, we can shoehorn it in there with maybe another key inside of local storage, another variable, another separate array that kept track of at this index is this complete, but that would be a lot. So instead, we're going to refactor this into being an array of objects. Each object will have a content property that says whatever you've entered, and each object will have a completed property which will start out at false. So let's go ahead and refactor that real quick. And this is why I moved add entry into its own thing. So right now it's pushing content. I know, we'll get to this guy in a second, but we got to work backwards a little bit for this. So on 23, we say todos.push content. That's pushing the string directly in there. We're going to change this so that it's an object with content inside of it. And in order to make this work, I have to take the data that was in the previous format out because it's not set up for what we're about to do. If I refresh this, we get a problem over here. There we go, object. It gets a little messy over here, but we can see inside of our application's local storage, we now have an array of objects that have a content property on them. Well, let's change it one more step to add that new feature that we wanted to it. By default, when we add a new entry into our array of to-dos, we're going to mark it as completed as false. So if I get rid of this guy, and I refresh the page, and I add a new entry, don't worry about this again, we have an array of objects. Content is feed goldfish, sure, but now we have somewhere to store whether or not this particular to-do is complete, and it starts off as false. All right, does the splice still work? Yeah, because we're just removing, that one is just removing an entry at a particular index. It doesn't matter what's inside of the array at that particular index. So if I add a couple of these, we see that it's being stored inside of memory just fine. We can add an entry at index 0 that has completed as false, feed goldfish, feed cat, feed dog, but this is the only part that's giving us trouble. Let's go ahead and delete the entry at index 1, because 0, 1, 2, which should be feed cat. We should be left with the entry for feed goldfish and the entry for feed dog. Works just fine. But what's going on with our rendering? Well, if we head down to render list item, it is responsible for taking the entire item and adding it here. So it's taking this entire object, which it really doesn't know how to turn into a string. Actually, it does. We just don't like how it turns it into a string. And it pops it into the element. You and I want to instead get the content property on that object. So over here, nice and simple, item.content. Go ahead and save that, head back over here, and there's our feed goldfish and feed dog, because again, I have the live server up, so it's automatically refreshing whenever I make changes. It is now digging through and getting the content for each element inside of this array one at a time, and tucking it inside of here as the string that we see on the screen inside of that span. All right, and we can, of course, still delete things. It just makes a lot more sense now. And I can add things as well. Let's bring the cat and the goldfish back, our good friends. All right, so we now have the structure that we can use to implement our toggle complete entry, because now we can go to an entry at a particular index inside of that array and say, hey, your completed is now whatever it wasn't a second ago. So I'm going to make it so that when we do this, let's see, we say to-dos index dot completed equals not to-dos index dot completed. So what this is doing is it's tunneling into to-dos into the object at that particular index and setting its completed property equal to the Boolean opposite of whatever it was a second ago. So if it was false a second ago, it will set it to true. And if it was true a second ago, it will set it to false. All right, and down here, just like we did for the others, we're going to go ahead and invoke on list update to update both what's inside of our local storage as well as what's rendering on the page. And now, all right, like I said, we're kind of working backwards. We created the specifics. Now let's work back to where this hooks into our logic. Over here, I'm going to make it so that if you click on the name, it will toggle complete. Yes. So down here, I'm going to go ahead and say, let's see, item name element dot add event listener click function, just like we added it to that button. And again, we don't have to worry about the event in this context. We're not doing anything special with it. But inside of here, we're going to invoke that toggle complete entry at the index, just like we invoked remove entry at the index. All right. Drum roll, please. So now if I click feed cat, we can see that the completed is being toggled for the ones that we're clicking. I clicked feed cat and then I clicked feed goldfish and both of them toggled to true. Let's unfeed the cat. I click it again and it toggles it to the opposite of whatever it was before. So now I can click this and every time I do, it changes completed to true or false. All right, well that's all well and good, but the user's going to see this. So what value does that have to them? Well, let's go ahead and make it so that when we render these items to the page, there's some representation of whether or not it's completed. Over here, I'm going to make it so that each item name element, when it's rendered to the page, let's see, dot style dot, what is it, text decoration is strike through, I think. Let's find out. If I click one of these, no, that's not the right thing. Hold on. I have to look these up every once in a while. It was text decoration. I was pretty close. What did I miss? Text decoration is, oh, line dash through. Okay. Wrong value. There we go. Ah, cool. They're all complete. No. Well, what I did is I added it regardless. Well, we know that the CSS is correct because it's popping up the way that we want it to if completed is true. But right now, that's happening to all of them. I didn't ask if that item was true, if that item was completed before adding this. So let's go ahead and add that step. We're only going to do this if item.completed. If the item is completed, then we'll put a line through it, and there we go. So now if I click on it, that toggle is toggling both the completed value under here, but also whether or not it is crossed out on the page. And with that, we have implemented a full CRUD operability. We are able to create an entry. We are able to read existing entries. We are able to update existing entries, and we are able to delete existing entries. Now, granted, this is all CRUD operability in the terms of just a front-end application, but there you go. And obviously, you can take this project and you can tweak it to your liking. You can make this, instead of a new to-do, anything that you want to do. It doesn't need to say to-do here. It can say anything that you want to say. I'm not feeling too creative right now. I thought I had something, but I do have another project that will go along these same lines. And we'll refactor it such that it uses the logic that we have here, but it integrates with an external API. All right, until then, have yourself a great rest of your day, and I look forward to seeing you next time. Take care.